Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter what time zone we find ourselves in right now, what matters is that we are witnessing one of those historical junctures that will define the geopolitical future of Western Eurasia. And this cup I have here with me, this beautiful handcrafted Syrian ceramic piece that I brought from Damascus years ago, will be our talisman to decipher the deepest layers of what is happening right now in Aleppo. Before we continue, I need to be completely transparent with you. I'm using an AI avatar to produce this content more quickly and deliver timely analysis to you. But let me be crystal clear. Every single piece of research, every analysis, every insight you hear comes directly from me. I have over 15 years of field experience in geopolitics, working as a consultant for governments, serving as an observer in conflict zones, and publishing in specialized journals. The AI is simply a tool for faster production. The expertise, the research, the analysis, that's all mine, built over years of study and direct experience in the field. Now, let's get to what really matters. What we see unfolding in the streets of Aleppo is not simply another episode of regional violence. No, friends, this is the final act of a geopolitical tragedy that began decades ago, when Atlanticist elites decided that the heart of Eurasia must remain fragmented to preserve their moribund hegemony. Let me place you in the historical context that nobody wants you to understand. Syria is not just a country. It is the crossroads where three continents intersect, where the millennial trade routes of the Silk Road meet the Mediterranean coasts. It's the place where Persian Gulf gas must pass to reach Europe, bypassing Russian pipelines. And precisely for this reason, for more than a decade, it has been the theater of operations for the most sophisticated hybrid war we have seen in the 21st century. When the Americans, British, and French decided to destroy the Syrian state in 2011, they didn't do it out of love for democracy. They did it because a Qatari gas pipeline that would cross Syria to Europe would have completely reconfigured the Eurasian energy balance. They did it because Damascus, together with Tehran and Moscow, represented the core of resistance to the unipolar order that Washington was trying to perpetuate at any cost. A Qatari pipeline crossing Syria to Europe would have eliminated European dependence on Russian gas and converted Qatar, a Washington ally, into Europe's primary energy supplier. Assad said no, and that's why he had to fall. Now we arrive at the neuralgic point of today's story, Operation Aleppo. For years, the Pentagon and CIA built their network of proxies in northeastern Syria, using the facade of the Syrian Democratic Forces, an Orwellian euphemism for the PKK-YPG, the same organization that Turkey, a NATO member, considers terrorist. The irony is delicious, an Atlantic alliance where one member fights another member's proxy. But here's where the story gets really fascinating, because what's happening now in Aleppo shows us that even the best imperial plans can crumble when deep historical forces come into play. The new government of Damascus, led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, is not the same one that Washington's strategists expected to control. Assad's fall did not lead to the chaos that Atlanticist planners had designed. Instead, an administration emerged that paradoxically is aligning with Syrian sovereignty interests that Ankara has promoted for years. This is the Machiavellian moment when the puppets cut their strings. On March 10th, what is known as the Damascus Agreement was signed between Damascus and the SDF. In theory, the YPG PKK was supposed to hand over its heavy weapons and withdraw east of the Euphrates River. In practice, they did exactly the opposite. They reinforced their positions in Aleppo, intensified their attacks with kamikaze drones, and basically told the new Syrian government, "We don't recognize your authority." Because what the YPG PKK didn't calculate is that Washington is no longer in a position to guarantee their survival. The American empire is too busy managing the Ukrainian debacle, the Iranian crisis, and now the humiliating withdrawal from Venezuela. The abandoned proxies in Syria have become a toxic asset that the United States can no longer afford to maintain. But there's another layer in this geopolitical onion that is absolutely crucial to understanding what's happening. Russia, which maintained its military presence in Syria despite all Western pressures, now finds itself in an extraordinarily favorable position. Moscow not only preserved its naval and air bases on the Syrian coast, but now has a government in Damascus that perfectly understands that its survival depends on maintaining balance among the great powers. And Turkey. Erdogan has played this game with a mastery that not even Metternich would have imagined. For years, he maintained open channels with all Syrian factions while fighting the PKK on Syrian territory. Now, with the new government in Damascus, Ankara sees the historic opportunity to create that safe zone in northern Syria that it has pursued for a decade. This is the configuration that is terrifying Atlanticist planners, a de facto alliance between Ankara, Damascus, and Moscow to clean northeastern Syria of separatist elements backed by the United States. What we witnessed in Aleppo during these last days are not ethnic riots as Western media tries to present them. It is a surgical operation by the Syrian army to restore state sovereignty in territories that had been effectively occupied by foreign paramilitary forces. The operation began on January 6th in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyeh, two enclaves that the YPG PKK had converted into mini-states within the state. For 16 days, Syrian forces have applied a strategy of gradual siege, offering humanitarian corridors to civilians while isolating combatants. YPG PKK commanders received direct orders from Kandil, the mountain where PKK leadership hides in northern Iraq, to resist to the end, not to negotiate, not to seek political agreement, to fight to the death. Why? Because PKK leaders know that if they lose Aleppo, they lose all credibility before Washington. And if they lose credibility before Washington, they lose the flow of weapons, money, and logistical support that has maintained their separatist project for years. But here comes the plot twist nobody saw coming. Trump, who just assumed his second term, finds himself facing an impossible dilemma to solve. On one hand, the U.S. national security establishment, especially the Pentagon and CIA, considers the YPG PKK as one of their few viable assets in the Middle East. On the other hand, Turkey is officially a NATO ally, and Erdogan has made it very clear that the continuity of the Kurdish separatist project in Syria is an absolute red line for Ankara. And Trump, who calls himself the ultimate dealmaker, realizes there's no possible deal here. Any continued support for the YPG PKK will definitively destroy relations with Turkey. Any abandonment of the YPG PKK will mean the loss of the last American foothold in the Levant. This is the perfect strategic trap. Washington designed a policy that worked while it could simultaneously maintain good relations with Ankara and support for the YPG PKK, but that fundamental contradiction has now exploded in their faces. Now, as we speak, attention has shifted toward Deir ez-Zor, a strategic city east of Aleppo, where the YPG PKK has concentrated its most trained and best equipped forces. The Syrian army has declared the entire region west of the Euphrates a closed military zone and is moving heavy artillery and armor toward the front lines. Military analysts I know in Moscow tell me this will be the decisive battle. If the Syrian army manages to clean Deir ez-Zor, it will have effectively restored state control over all territory west of the Euphrates. If the YPG PKK manages to hold Deir ez-Zor, it can argue before Washington that it remains a viable force and deserves continued support. But here's the problem for Washington strategists. Even if the YPG PKK holds Deir ez-Zor, what have they really gained? An isolated enclave, surrounded by hostile forces, completely dependent on American air support to survive. That is, an asset that consumes resources without generating strategic advantages. And we cannot forget the factor that is perhaps the most determining of all, China. Beijing has been silently observing how the Syrian drama unfolds, but its presence is felt in every important strategic decision. The New Silk Road, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history, requires stability in Western Asia. Syria, located at the crossroads between Asia, Europe, and Africa, is a key piece on this board. Syrian ports on the Mediterranean can become Western terminals for trade routes that originate in Shanghai and traverse all of Eurasia. But this is only possible if there exists a functional and sovereign Syrian state. The YPG PKK proto-state, financed by Washington and dedicated to creating permanent chaos, is incompatible with Chinese economic interests in the region. That's why, although China does not intervene militarily in Syria, its influence is felt through its capacity to offer massive investment in post-conflict reconstruction. What we are witnessing in Aleppo is much more than a local military operation. It is the symbol of the collapse of the Atlanticist paradigm that has dominated international relations since the end of the Cold War. For 30 years, Washington could impose its will using a combination of military power, financial domination, and control of global media narratives. It could intervene in any country, overthrow any government, and install any regime that served its interests, all under the banner of democracy and human rights. But that paradigm is disintegrating before our eyes. In Ukraine, the Western proxy is being militarily defeated by Russia. In the Middle East, Israel is trapped in a war of attrition it cannot win. In East Asia, China is building a parallel economic system that makes the US dollar irrelevant. And now in Syria, even the most loyal proxies are being eliminated by local governments that no longer fear imperial reprisal. This is the reality of the emerging multipolarity that so many analysts have predicted, but few have truly understood. It's not simply a world with multiple centers of power. It's a world where the institutional architecture built by Washington to perpetuate its hegemony has become dysfunctional and irrelevant. The new Syrian government doesn't need UN Security Council permission to restore its territorial sovereignty. It doesn't need IMF approval to rebuild its economy. It doesn't need CNN's blessing to legitimize its actions. It has the support of Eurasian powers that offer viable alternatives to the Atlanticist system. And here we arrive at the fundamental question that will determine not only Syria's future, but the future of world order. Will Washington be capable of accepting the reality of a multipolar world? Or will it try to preserve its moribund hegemony through an escalation that could lead us to direct global conflict? The next days in Deir ez-Zor will give us the answer. If the Syrian army manages to complete the liberation of territory west of the Euphrates without provoking direct American military intervention, we will have witnessed a historical moment comparable to the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan or the fall of the Berlin Wall. If Washington decides to intervene to save its Kurdish proxies, we will be facing the possibility of direct conflict between nuclear superpowers for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's why every bullet fired in Aleppo, every drone that falls on Deir ez-Zor, every position that changes hands in northeastern Syria is not just about Syria. It's about what kind of world order our children will inherit. And from this small corner of Paris, with my Syrian cup filled with Yemeni coffee, I watch fascinated as David prepares his sling for the final confrontation with Goliath. The events in Aleppo are not the end of a story. They are the prelude to a new era in international relations. An era where Beijing, Moscow, Delhi, Tehran, Brasilia, and other capitals of the global south will write the rules of the game, not just Washington and London. And in that new era, countries like Syria, located at critical intersections of Eurasian geography, will recover the strategic importance they had for millennia before the parenthesis of Western domination. History has not ended. In fact, it is just beginning. A history that will be written in Asiatic, not Atlantic. Until next time, from the heart of the declining empire. May multipolarity accompany you, and may the wisdom of Damascus illuminate the path toward a truly sovereign world.